Hello, welcome to part 4 of the Intro to Groom tutorial. For this part we're going to be going over Lookdev and making your groom look nice. So well done if you've got to this part already and you've got something that looks nice in the viewport here. For this I've made a time lapse of how I did this so you can kind of see the process, and then I'll put that in a separate video as well for you guys to see. I'm just going to assume that you've now done the previous part and got something that's nice looking in here, and now you're ready to start giving it materials and stuff. So let's jump right into it. So the first thing we need to make sure we've got checked is the attributes. After you've made your hair gen look nice, you need to make sure that we're deleting any excess attributes that we don't need. So you see in this one we've got all these random primitive attributes and loads of point attributes, and it's basically all just stuff that we don't need. So we're just going to drop down an attribute delete, and if you want to pause the video here, these are the ones that you need for importing into Solaris. You technically don't need the tightness one, but I've added that in there because it's useful for Lookdev. And then after that, we need to drop down a attribute transfer. And this is connected to the skin input. Yeah, on the skin we've got some point attributes. They're just areas I've drawn with an attribute paint that just say like, I want a different color of hair in maybe this section here. I've done another one on the top and some on the sides as well. And then these are just kind of like rough masks just so I can change the color of hair in different locations. So you can edit this as you need to. If you have different areas of hair that you want to be different colors, yeah, paint them in here, and then we're going to transfer them onto the hairs themselves. So we do an attribute transfer, and you can see I've done color mask and top of head. I'm also going to do back of head. And after that, I've just done a guide collide just to make sure they're not intersecting with the mesh. So if I turn this on, you can see they're all nicely lying on top of it. And then the other thing we need to do, because these are point attributes, we need to promote them to primitive attributes, so they're affecting the entire hair. So you see I haven't done it on these ones, and it's kind of like changes across the hair. And you might want this for some types of hairs, particularly like guard hairs or spines. But for what I want to do with this, these need to be primitive attributes. So promoting them to primitive attributes makes the entire hair be affected by that. And we can use that for shading. You can also mix and match these, so you can have some with primitive attributes, some with point attributes instead, and we can just use those for Lookdev as well. After that, I've dropped down a resample, and it's not actually resampling the curves at all, it's just to get the curve view attribute. I find this is a very useful attribute for Lookdev. The root of the hair is 0, and the tips of the hair is 1, and then everything along is in between. But it's also another useful one for Lookdev. So I just like to add that in there. After that, before we've done this, I'm just going to delete that. So we'll have it all connected and wired up into the output. And just before we export it, we need to go over into stage. So in the stage layer, we need to drop down a SOP import. And we're just going to SOP import the hair gen. There we go. Basically what I'm going to do here is just check before I export that all the materials that I want are exporting correctly, so that not exporting them and then having to go back and forth between the Lookdev file and this file. So I drop down a SOP import and then a material library and an assign material. And in here we're just going to do a very, very basic hair gen. So drop down a karma material. I'm going to get rid of all that and put down a karma hair. And then we're just going to assign this. So primitives, so we're going to assign it to the SOP import, and we're going to just use the only material that's there. So see, this is now changed color because we've assigned the material to it. And if we put it into Karma CPU, you can see that it's got this nice hair material. And we're not going to be doing the actual Lookdev in this part. We're going to be doing that in a separate file, but this part is just to check that the attributes are working. So to have a look at those, we need to do a geometry property value. So it's one of these. And then I'm just going to check the curve view attribute is working. So just type curve view in there and wire that up to like the melanin. There we go. And you can see the roots of it are now white and the tips are now black. And everything in between is kind of a gradient. We could try it with the tightness attribute as well, see how that's going to look. And if you find they're all coming out as just a dark material or completely white material, then you've either spelt this wrong or it's not exporting the attribute, in which case we'd need to go back to the OBJ layer, and in our attributes here, just check that they are set as output attributes. So you see, I haven't got some of them in here, so top of head isn't going to export, and color mask's already exporting. So once we've checked that, we're going to go into here and we'll drop down a USD export. Just wire that up. This one's nice and easy. Basically what we're going to do is just export this and take it into another file. So they're nice and organized. So I'm going to call this groom underscore and goblin head. And then we're just going to use this name as our output name. So in the export tab, I'm just going to set the file path to our USD vault primitives, and then I'm just going to do $os dot, then our version number, and then .usd. And you can see I've done a few of them already. If you want to see what it's going to look like, if you middle click this, it'll show you the actual name instead of the $os. So let's just save to disk. Now let's save this and open up a new file. So if you've got a Lookdev scene set up already, you can skip to the timestamp on screen. If not, I'm going to walk you through a very quick Lookdev scene, just so you can get something nice to work with. So what we're going to do first is go to the stage and then drop down a primitive. And this is going to be for setting up our scene graph down here. So you'll see there's currently just primitive 1 in there. This is going to be for organizing all of our objects and primitives and stuff and where they're going to go. Don't have to worry too much about this at the moment, but you can always change it after. I'm just going to call this scene setup. I'm just going to say this is called scene, and you'll see when I change this in here, this becomes scene. And then anything else I add after this, so if I do scene slash layout, that's creating other folders in here. So we're going to do a scene, I'll do scene slash materials. We'll also do scene slash models and scene slash groom. There we go. So we've got some folders now to put our objects in. So after that, we're going to drop down a reference node. This is very similar to the sublayer and asset reference, but we can specify the primitive path. I'm going to bring in our goblin geometry just to begin with. So that's going to go into model. And I'm just going to say goblin. And hopefully, when I add this in, it will... Oh, we haven't saved our file yet. So let's save this. I'm going to call this goblin lookdev, groom lookdev. And then when I look in $hip, here we go. So let's grab our goblin asset. And it's going to give a little message here just saying it's targeting a missing explicit primitive, which is basically just saying it's creating this extra folder because it's not targeting one. So you see I've put it into model goblin and it's just basically plonked that in there. When we're setting up this scene as well, it's a good idea to make sure this is set to the Houdini viewport and not the Karma one, just because it tends to run very, very slowly and you'll find it lags a lot. You'll notice once I've switched this over as well, it's gone very, very blocky looking, and that's because this is using a proxy geometry. So in the scene setup for this model, I did a poly reduce, so there's less polygons when you're looking through the viewport. So the easiest way to fix this is just come to these sunglasses here, and just turn on render and turn off proxy. There we go, nice high poly model. Okay, so I'm going to call this geo underscore goblin, and then we're going to drop down another reference and call this groom underscore goblin, and connect that up to this. For this, make sure you control click this if it's not coming up with this. Sometimes Houdini is a bit funny about these. So we're going to drop this down into the groom, and I'm going to do / goblin. I've got two of these. I think it's coming up as this weird temp file at the end because I'm on a non-commercial version of Houdini. So if you're using the education edition or the full commercial one, this will just be .usd. That should work fine. But this works as well for now. So let's grab these, merge them together with Alt-click. Then we're going to drop down a null, just to say this is going to be in geometry. And then after that, we're going to drop down a transform. And this is going to be for making our Lookdev scene rotate. So I'm going to animate that later. After that, we need to drop down a material library and also an assign material. These are where we're going to be doing all of our Lookdev, so I'm going to separate that a little bit. After that, we're going to drop down another assign material, and this is going to be our utility material. So this is one we're going to toggle on and off, just so we can see what it's going to look like with the skin color and with like a default shader as well. So I'm just going to call this utility material. After that, let's drop down some lights. So I'm going to do a regular light, I'm going to do a dome light, and then I'm also going to duplicate this for a rim light. With lighting, it's good to have one neutral HDRI, and then if you've already done your filming, do an onset HDRI as well, or the one that's going to be used in the final film, just so you can toggle between like a neutral look and then what it's going to look like in the film. It lets you just kind of see what it's going to look like in different scenarios to check it actually looks right and not just like just in that one scene. So I'm going to do HDRI neutral, and then this one's going to be HDRI film. Okay, and then we're going to actually put a switch between these two as well, so we can switch between them. Okay. And let's grab all of these, click this, and Alt-click to merge them. And then we're going to merge this with the pipeline as well. Probably also set these lights up. So for using these like lighting tools up here, it's best to disable the groom because they're curved. So when you click on them, sometimes they get a bit confused and go like really, really far away. And then you have to get them back and it's just annoying. So I find disabling the groom while we're doing the lighting is a bit easier. Sometimes I'll even add just a sphere in where the groom's going to be, but his head's quite spherical, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to use his head for now. Let's drop down the key light. So we're going to click on this. If this doesn't appear, just press enter over the viewport. And then I'm going to say I want a diffuse light on his forehead. And then the rim light, I'm going to say I want diffuse on like the edge of his head. Maybe coming from like the back somewhere. And then also the HDRI. So let's do the neutral one first. I think this one's the neutral one. And then I'm just going to say that this open field one is our film one. So if you look through here, they should appear. Then after that, we've got to put in some cameras. So I'm going to drop down another merge. Lots of merges here. I'm going to drop down another camera. And we're just going to call this cam1. Let's plug that into the pipe. And let's just position this camera so it's in like a nice area. So if we look through this, it should let us see it up here. Lock the viewport, move this into a nicer place. Maybe kind of like just around here. So unlock the viewport. And then after that, we need to drop down a LPE tag. So this is for if you're going to do some compositing and you're going to clean up the lights. This will let you separate the lights and then control them individually in compositing programs. So if you're using Nuke, you can use a grade node and then turn the lights up and down after. So we're going to tag these using the light name. And you'll see we've now got 3 lights here. And I've named them so they're all kind of like a bit organized. So we know what's what. Okay, after that, let's drop down a Karma node. If we look through here, we can start configuring our render settings. So one important thing to note when you're doing Lookdev, you need to lock down if you're going to be using CPU or XPU at the beginning. I tend to find the groom will look very different depending on which one you choose. I prefer to use CPU as it tends to be more stable for rendering, and also if you're using the Hertfordshire render farm, those use CPU, or they did when I was there. Tends to be what most companies use for render farms, so I'm going to stick to CPU for this. But if you plan to do local rendering, XPU might be a better bet. After this, I'm going to turn down the secondary samples a little bit. just so it renders a bit faster. And also I'm going to turn off the camera effects because we don't need them. There shouldn't be any motion blur and there shouldn't be any depth of field in your Lookdev. We're also going to turn on our volume up to 1 and our subsurface scattering up to 1. Let's set the cameras and also our output picture. So currently got it set to just the render. I want to put it into this 3D render one. So this is going to be Lookdev turntable $f4. So that's 4 numbers of padding .exr, because then we can composite it after. Another good thing you might want to do is turning on dicing and just setting the dicing camera to your render camera. Dicing is kind of like subdividing based on how close something is to the camera. That's pretty much it for the Lookdev setup. Other than this, you can just kind of put these in boxes with Shift-O, C to bring up this and color the boxes. So you can organize that how you want. That's the scene setup. Before we start doing anything with materials, I'm going to explain a bit how the anatomy of the hair works, because it's a little bit more complicated than you might think. So it's not just curves. So hair is made up of 3 layers. We've got the cuticle, which is kind of like the outer layer. That's made of keratin. And it's kind of composed of these like little scales that go up along the hair. And then inside that, we've got the cortex. And the cortex is where all of the melanin's stored. So that's how the hair gets its kind of brown color or red color. That's where all of that comes from. And then inside of that, we've got a medulla, which it's only present in some types of hair. We'll get into that into a little bit. But it's kind of like the inner core of the hair, and it makes the hair look thick, basically. It's not as transparent when the medulla is thicker. Let's have a look at the hair shader and see how this is being done in this. So if you go into the material library and drop down a Karma material builder, which is KMB as a shortcut, and we're just going to name this. And then I'm just going to assign this to our goblin. One other thing you need to set up with the materials is the path prefix. So it currently goes into one just called materials. I'd like to put it inside this scene bit here so it's all contained together. So I've got this scene materials. And just make sure you put a / here as well, and that will go into a folder. So let's have a look at the hair shader. So we can get rid of all this, we're not going to use that. And just drop down a Karma hair shader. I forgot to set the material path as well. So we're going to say materials, and we want that one. To see how this is working, we're going to go into the CPU viewport. And you'll see it's gone to like pretty nice looking shader already, actually. You can get 99% of the way there with just this Karma hair shader. So in humans, there's 2 types of hair. So we've got our vellus hair, which is kind of like peach fuzz. It's the stuff that's kind of scattered all along the body. It's this really, really thin, light hair, and it stands on end when it's cold. It's also known as an undercoat on animals. So if we've got like rabbits and stuff, that would be vellus hair. And then the second type of hair is the terminal hair. So this is kind of like your main hair. So it'd be like eyebrows, hair on your head, eyelashes. Basically everything else that isn't peach fuzz is terminal hair. So the main difference between these two is that the terminal hair has a medulla and the vellus hair doesn't. The medulla is what gives the hair this kind of thick look, and this one's kind of like a wiry, thin look. In humans and in animals, the medulla is quite different. So there's this thing called the medulla index, and it's basically just the diameter of the medulla divided by the diameter of the actual hair strand. And in humans, this is 0.33, and in animals, this tends to be a lot thicker. So we've got this diagram of cattle hair and human hair. You'll see the medulla is very, very thick in cattle hair and very thin in human hair. So in Houdini 20.5, they've added this new fur shader. Very, very similar to the hair shader. So they both work basically the same. The main difference is this one has a medulla in the middle. So it'll render the curve with like a central line going through the middle of it as well. So you tend to get more realistic results with this, but because it's newer, it might be a little bit more buggy. So this is the original one, and then this is the kind of like new improved one with Houdini 20.5. Use this one if you can, but if you're running into bugs, just move over to this one. They're basically the same. And I'll run you through some of the parameters in this. They're exactly the same in this, but this one's got a few more controls, which I'll also go through. but we'll go through this one to start with. To begin with, I've got our base and our base color. This is the color of the Cortex. So if you've got like dyed hair, this would be a different color, and your melanin would be less because you would have bleached it. And that brings us on to melanin as well. So this literally just controls how much melanin is in the hair. It kind of does what it says on the tin. The scientific term for this one is eumelanin, which is a black and brown color. And then we've also got melanin redness, which is pheomelanin, which also does what it says on the tin. It makes it more red and yellow. Nice and easy controls, and they're physically accurate as well. Underneath that, we've got melanin randomize, because not all hair strands are the same, so we add a bit of randomization in here just to break up the colors a little bit, makes it a bit more realistic. Underneath that, we've got the thickness scale. This controls how the light's scattered through the hair, so if we make it very thin, the light's going to behave as if the hair strands are very thin. It's going to pass through it a lot more and not bounce around, so you get this kind of lighter color. And then if we bring that up, it goes darker because the light's bouncing around inside the hair a lot more. It's a bit like a multiplier for like the subsurface scattering. Underneath that, we've got the tint. This is more of like an artistic control. The tint is basically a multiplier on the final lighting result of the image. So it's not realistic, you're just kind of using it for artistic purposes. After that, we've got Specular. So the shift. The shift is basically where the highlight on the hair is going to be. So 0.03 is the default, and that's kind of like in the middle of the hair strand. And if we move this to either end, the highlight on the hair will move along the hair strand longitudinally. So if we move it this way, it'll go to the very end, and if we move it this way, it'll go to the very beginning of the hair. So that's if you want a bit more artistic control over it as well. You can kind of select where the highlight's going to be on the hair. Underneath that, we've got IOR. Don't really need to change this. This is also for just artistic control, and that's fine. I'd leave that as default. Underneath that, we've got the roughness. So this controls the roughness along the length of the hair. If we have roughness anisotropic enabled, you'll also notice there's this roughness azimuthal. It's basically just, this one controls the specular across the length of the hair, and this one controls the specular along the width of the hair. If you turn it down, the light gets reflected more in the hair, and if you turn it up, the light gets reflected out of the hair. Then we've got roughness randomize, which again is just kind of breaks up the roughness of the hair a bit. So turn that up for a bit of realism. And then we've got the coat. So the coat's kind of like if you want a layer of grease or like you want to have wet hair, you turn this up. This should always have like a little bit because hair's naturally greasy. So it always have a little bit of that on. I don't really tend to use these too much, so we're not going to worry about them for now. They've got their little tooltips on there, so if you're really interested in controlling this, you can play around with these, see how they look. I tend to just leave this off. Next tab, we've got our diffuse. So diffuse is more for artistic control. It's not a realistic thing, so if we turn this up, you'll see it goes like a normal material. You don't get any light kind of scattering through it anymore. It's all being reflected off. It kind of does what it says on the tin as well. They're very good at that. So it's just diffusing the light off instead of making it like transparent. Probably want to do this if you're doing like stylized hair or if you've got synthetic fibers that you want to look a certain way. You turn that up. And advanced, this is just for like seeds and stuff. If you turn on custom hair ID, it will set all of the hairs to a single ID. So you'd probably want to be wiring in something to that, like if you've got an attribute on here, you'd probably want to wire that in there. Otherwise, if you have this set all to the same one, so with this, all of the randomize basically just break, they'll all be set to the same thing. So if you're not planning to do anything with the custom hair IDs, just keep that off. That's pretty much all the controls on the default Karma hair node. So let's have a look at the fur shader. So it's pretty similar to the hair shader. It's a little bit newer. You might have some more bugs with it. So if you're finding that you're encountering some weird behaviors with it, it might be worth switching back to the normal Karma hair shader. But this one has a few extra bells and whistles that make it more realistic. So you'll notice all of this is basically the same. We've got base color, we've got melanin, all that fun stuff. Same as the hair shader. Instead of having a specular tab, it's been replaced with a Cortex and a Medulla tab. So in the Cortex, this one's pretty much the same as the specular tab in the hair shader. The only difference is we've also got cuticle reflectance and this extra advanced roughness down here. The cuticle reflectance is basically for controlling the outer shell of this. So for animal hair, it would be less because animal hair tends to be a bit more rough, so it'd reflect less light. And then with human hairs, it might be a bit more because it's reflecting more light. Have a little study of whatever groom type you're doing and see if you can get like close-ups of the hairs, if you can, like under a microscope. You can see how the cuticle scales are interacting. So I'm going to set this to a little bit higher because it's human hair. It's going to be a bit more reflective. I haven't really played with this yet. I haven't had much time to have a look at this. So I'm going to skip over this for now. As with any shader, just play around with it and see what it does. So the next one we've got the medulla. Medulla radius is the same as the medulla index. So it's the diameter of the medulla divided by the diameter of the hair. So humans, we've got 0.33 and less, and for animals, we've got 0.5 and more. So because this is a human type character, I'm just going to put it under 0.33. And I tend to find with kind of more wispy hair, this becomes less. You could do some expression as an input for this, but I'm just going to leave it as this for now. Medulla phase controls the way that the light scatters through the groom. So this should always be a positive number for realistic results because groom is forward scattering. So the light should pass through it and not get reflected off instead. So you can make this if you want some weird stylized results or like artistic control, whatever you want. Put this to a negative number and you'll get this darker hair. But for realistic results, you want to put this as a positive number so the light scatters through it. Okay, underneath this we've got the Medulla Diffuse, so if you want your hair to look thicker, you can turn this up. And also we've got the opacity and the pigment. The pigment controls the amount of light that's being absorbed by the medulla, so if we turn it down, you'll see that it's a little bit lighter. And if we put it back up, it's fully dark. So I wouldn't ever put these as like completely 1 or 0, so maybe 0.9. And then the opacity is literally does what it says on the tin, it just makes it more or less opaque. I don't tend to change this one from 1. It looks nice as it is. After that, we've got the Diffuse tab again. This is just for artistic control. One thing I have found is you can make hair look a bit damaged if you turn this up. So for some parts of the hair, you might want, say, a certain section of it if it's like a bear or something, it's been scratched. And you could mark that with a point attribute and then say that the diffuse is higher on there. That would make it look a bit damaged. But again, this isn't a realistic way of shading it, so this is more for like artistic control. Okay, so that brings us on to bringing in attributes. So very, very easy with this. All you need to do is drop down a geometry property value and then type in your desired attribute to use. So I'm going to start with curve view because I know we've been using that one. And just plug this into the melanin. So it's 0 at the roots and 1 at the tips, so it's very, very white here and very, very dark here. If you're finding that if you plug this in and anything you type here is just defaulting to white, that's probably because your attributes haven't exported, so you need to go back and check that your attributes are being exported in the USD file. Also check that you're spelling it right. I've ran into so many times where I've spelled this slightly wrong. I'm like, why is it not working? What the hell? And it's just because it's spelled wrong. So always check your spelling here. A good thing to do is when you're making your attributes, just write them down on a list somewhere and you can just copy paste them back in. The way I prefer to work with these is I get this and then I do a remap. So just drop down a remap after that. And then that lets you control the bounds of, I never want it to be like completely 0. It'll always have some small number on either end of the scale. Good thing about using Material X as well is you can mix and match with these. So if we just copy this and use a different one, so I know we had back of head, so we can mix and match with other attributes. So we'll say back of head. I'm also going to remap this one, and then we can just add them together. There we go. So now the back of the head's very, very dark, and the other parts that aren't marked aren't. So you can always you can add them together. You can also multiply it and all that. It's the same as any other shader in Material X, except it's just working off of curves. We're going to have a look at giving the hair some color. So if we make it blue, we'd want to have less melanin as if it was bleached, and then coloring the cortex because of the dyes. What we'd do there is we get the property value. So I do property value. I'm just going to say color mask. That's one that we've drawn earlier. So that one's marking out sideburn areas and the back of the head here. I'm going to put this through a Material X multiply. And this needs to be going into the second input. And the first input, you'll see, because we've disconnected it, it lets you change the signature. So if we change this to color FA, you can now put this into whatever color we want. So I'm going to put this to kind of like a light blue color. Just making sure these aren't the highest possible values. And I'm just going to plug this into base color. And you see the dotted line there? That means that the input and the output types don't match, so it's being converted to a different one. So this one's a color attribute, so this is 3 floats. Basically, there's 3 parameters here, and this one only takes 1, so it's converting it to 1. But this one is a solid line, so it's exporting 3 and importing 3, and it's going, yes, this is right. I can fill all these here. So I'm just going to plug this one straight into our melanin and see how that looks. So that's very dark, so I'm going to remap it. And we'll just say the highest it can be is 0.32, or maybe 0.1. So if I swap this to top of head, now the top of its head should be a different color. And you can add these maps together. So we had this one before, and they're adding them together. I'm gonna multiply this one instead. So that's going to go into there, and that's going to go into there. It's very easy to just mix and match with these because Material X makes it nice and easy. So there's a few more things to go over. So there's multiple different types of hair when you're doing creatures. Most creatures will have 3 layers of hair. So they'll have an undercoat, and then they'll have piled fur, and then they'll have guard hairs. And the guard hairs and the piled fur are usually the bits that you see. So that'll be like the parts that have patterns on it, so like jaguar markings. So these markings here would be the guard hairs that you're seeing. They have multiple different types of guard hairs as well. So I've done this little diagram here. If I let's full screen this, so you can see it. So we've got awn hairs, or kind of like the main hairs that you'd imagine on things. So like cats have these. Pretty much every carnival has them. They rely in one direction, and that's what gives the markings. So all these are going to be awn hairs. Second we've got is bristles. So this would be like lions' manes. They're made up of these very, very thick protective coats. So bears would have this kind of fur as well. And then after that we've got our spines. So hedgehogs, porcupines, echidnas, that sort of thing. They've got these really long, spiky parts. And those are actually guard hairs as well. They've just got very, very large medullas in the middle of it. If we're going to say like this is going to be guard hairs, we're going to say these are spines. So the medulla radius is going to be very thick. The phase will probably be down a bit, and it'll be quite diffused as well. Probably not blue. But you can get 99% of the way there with just this default hair shader, which is quite nice. And I tend to only use these geometry property values to just add in some more variation or like separate out areas. So that part we had around here, which was like darker, that's kind of like the way I'd use these extra maps. And then I do everything else in here. Okay, so that pretty much sums up the calmer hair and fur. The other thing we might want to do while you're setting these up is add a default shader for the other geometry. I'm going to create another shader here, just call it MTL default, and just make this kind of like a kind of mid-grey color with very rough specular. We don't need these, so I'm just going to delete them. And then this is going to be what we're going to use for the utility materials. So this encompasses just anything that's in the model, basically. So I'm going to shift open this and just select all our geometry here and say that this is using our default material. It makes it a bit easier to see like where the hairs are starting and ending. especially if you're doing like a creature or something. I always find it useful to have this default shader, and it lets you just focus on what's going on here and not what's going on here. There's also, if you've got a very heavy shader that's going on your actual model, you don't want to be calculating that every time while you're doing this, so it's always good to have a nice, easy to render shader. So rendering. So you can either render it directly in this with the turntable, or you can export this using a USD ROP. What that will do is it will save everything that's coming up the pipe here as a USD file, and then that will let us layer in just the materials and the hair. So if you've got simulated hair or animated hair, this will let you lay it on top of that. So if you're rendering it inside this, we're doing like a turntable, all we need to do is add a transform after our geometry and keyframe it on frame 1, and then on frame 120, keyframe that to be 360 degrees. Just alt click that. So there we go, he spins. I'm going to set that to the Houdini viewport just so we can see it a bit nicer. And then also we want the lights to rotate around him so we can see how the lights are affecting the hair. So it's going to drop down another transform just after the lights. And on frame 120, I'm going to alt click this to set a keyframe and then go to the last frame and go 360. There we go. And because it's 240 frames, this is exactly 10 seconds. So you get a nice 10-second looping animation. One of the things to look out for when you're doing this is the default interpolation of the curves, so the animation curves, set to Bezier. If you don't know what that means, basically it speeds up and slows down when it's rotating. So as it gets here, it slows down a bit. This is one of the things I got marked down for when I was submitting stuff for uni. So to fix this, you just have to go into this little waveform thing down in the corner, and that'll let you see the curves. So you see we've got this kind of like S shape. All you have to do is just select those and hit this straight line up here. That'll make it linear. So we'll do this on here as well, on this transform up here. There we go. It should loop nicely. There we go. That's pretty much everything. Yeah, if you've got any questions, either drop a comment below this or message me on LinkedIn or Discord, whatever you prefer, and I'll see how I can help. Good luck, and yeah, that's pretty much it from me.